Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. In 1939, Churchill described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. The aphorism is as true today under Russian President Vladimir Putin as it was under Stalin. Bill Browder is with us from London. Bill is the founder of Hermitage Capital, one of the biggest investors in Russia after the fall of communism. He steered Hermitage from a $25 million fund to a $45 billion fund in less than a decade, with investors making over 20 times their money. He is now one of Putin's most formidable critics. Bill is the author of a new book entitled Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath, a thriller which topped the New York Times bestseller list. The book spins a riveting tale of corruption, money laundering, and political assassination that is a must-read for anyone wondering where it is all going with Putin's Russia. We're pleased to welcome Bill Browder to the program. Well, Bill, congratulations on your book, which was absolutely fabulous. Now, is it a sequel to your first book, Red Notice, which received critical acclaim? Why two books? Why is this book different from the other book?
Well, so my first book, Red Notice, was all about how I the rags to riches, to rags, et cetera, story of my career in finance, and then the beginning of my fight with Vladimir Putin, which resulted in the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in Russian police custody. And the first book ends in 2012 when I get a law called the Magnitsky Act passed in the United States, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of people who killed Sergei and other human rights violators in Russia. And of course, the story continued after 2012 quite dramatically in a lot of different ways. One is that we wanted to get Magnitsky Acts passed all over the world. And the second is we wanted to figure out who got the money that was connected to Sergei Magnitsky's murder. He uncovered a massive corruption scheme, and we want to know who got the money. And as we went around the world passing more Magnitsky Acts and figuring out who got the money, Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. And he started chasing me and everybody connected to me, everyone involved in this justice campaign. And more people were killed, more assassination attempts, arrests, honey traps, lawsuits, and everything else you can think of. It's a people when they read it, they say this reads like a Tom Clancy or John le Carré thriller, but the reality is that it happened in real life.
Truth is stranger than fiction. Now, let me ask you, how many Magnitsky Acts have you been successful in enacting in various countries of the world?
So after it was passed in 2012 in the United States, we got it passed in Canada, in the UK, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Following that, the European Union signed up for all 27 members of the European Union. We then got Australia, Norway, Montenegro, Kosovo, the Channel Islands, the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands. So if we take all the major countries, eliminate all the little ones out of there are 34 real countries that have Magnitsky Acts, and there's a whole bunch of other ones on deck. We're working now on Switzerland, on New Zealand, on Japan, and hopefully at some point in the future, every country that a Russian oligarch or a Chinese oligarch would want to store their stolen money would have a Magnitsky Act, and so those countries would be off limits, and they'd find themselves basically not being able to travel and having their financial affairs curtailed.
Is it an effective tool against human rights violators like Putin?
Well, the best way of judging its effectiveness is to look how mad Putin got after the Magnitsky Act was passed. So when the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, Putin just got crazy with fury. In his first response was to ban the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. Many people will remember that. After doing that, he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He actually even sent an emissary to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016. Everyone who's watching this may remember the famous Trump Tower meeting. That was a woman named Natalia Veselnitskaya, who was an agent of Putin, went to Trump Tower, and it was before Trump was elected, but after he was nominated. And the meeting was with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner. And the purpose of the meeting was to ask them, if Trump gets elected, would he repeal the Magnitsky Act? And so how effective it is, I think, is demonstrated by how much of an effort Putin has made to try to get rid of this thing.
All right, so let's just shift for a moment to Putin macro, Ukraine. What do you think Putin has in mind in Ukraine? Why did he invade Ukraine?
One of the things which I discovered in this period of time that I wrote about in my book was that the money that was stolen that Sergei Magnitsky had uncovered, the corruption scheme, which was $230 million, Putin was a beneficiary of. And one of the other things we discovered is that this was one of 1,000 similar crimes, which totaled $230 billion. And the other thing that we discovered was that this was just what we could identify in a certain small group of Scandinavian banks. And there's Austrian banks and German banks and other banks probably doing the same thing for Russian money launderers. And so I estimate that Putin has stolen from the Russian people over a 22-year period, for himself and for the people around him, the 1,000 people around him, $1 trillion. And that's money that should have been spent on healthcare, on schools, on potholes in the roads and public services of all kinds, was spent on private jets and yachts and villas in the south of France. And I believe that after 22 years of doing this, the Russian people were getting pretty fed up. And I don't know what the spark would have been to light it all on fire, but I think that Putin was afraid that he had effectively a totally combustible situation there. And if he didn't do something proactively, he would be sitting in the Kremlin and 1 million people would march on Red Square. And so what does he do? He starts a war. And he starts this war in Ukraine, not because he hates Ukraine, not because he wants to rebuild the Russian Empire, not because of NATO enlargement. He starts this war because he needs a foreign enemy, and he needs a foreign enemy to keep the people from being mad at him. And so I believe this war in Ukraine is necessary for Putin to stay in power. And I believe that no matter what some countries might push Zelensky to compromise on, none of them will work, because the only thing that's going to work in Vladimir Putin's eyes is to be at war. And for what it's worth, if it's not Ukraine, it'll be the Baltics next, which are NATO countries. And so I think it's very important that everyone understands what this war is all about, because if we understand what it's about, then we might have some idea of what to do about it.
Is the war popular with the Russian people?
Well, it's hard to imagine that it's popular with the Russian people, but they don't know they're at war. The Russian people believe that there's some kind of special, limited military operation to free Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Nazis. And the way it's presented by the Kremlin is that this is a humanitarian effort. This is a good versus evil. The Russia's good and the West is evil, and that the Russians should all be mad at any of these sanctions that are coming down the pike and costing people money. And so I would say that among the Russian population, there's a lot of ignorance about what's going on. And to the extent that they're not ignorant, they're all sort of whipped up into a nationalist frenzy right now.
Now, are you critical of President Biden's response to the Russian invasion?
Well, if you had known me over the last 20 years, you would know that I'm generally critical of all governments, U.S. government, British government, European Union, et cetera. But in this one particular case, I'm not critical. I think that Biden has handled himself very well. I would say he got started a little bit too late. We could have been given more weapons sooner. We could have sanctioned more oligarchs sooner. We probably should have sanctioned some before the war even began to show Putin we were serious. But if I were to make a wish list of all the things that I would have wanted to do to Putin in this circumstance, I think that Biden is doing pretty much everything on my list. And of course, he could be doing it more and better, but I'd give him a pretty solid, 9 out of 10, maybe even 10 out of 10 in terms of how we're pursuing this war right now.
Do you think the sanctions have been effective against Putin and the Russians?
I think that sanctions are effective in certain cases, depending on what, it's like a medicine. It depends how the disease has progressed when you administer it. If we had administered the sanctions early, before the war, Putin would have seen that and might have had a different calculation about the costs versus the benefits of this war. He was under the impression, having watched our weak response over the last 22 years to everything else he's done, which has been terrible, with no sanctions, and he thought maybe the same thing would happen here. I mean, he invaded Georgia in 2008, no sanctions. He illegally took Crimea, no sanctions. He shot down a passenger plane with 298 innocent civilians, no sanctions. He used weapons-grade chemical weapons in Salisbury, England, no sanctions. So he was kind of convinced that everything would be just like it always was. And had we shown that we had these proper teeth to bite into him, he might have done something different.
Well, are the sanctions tough enough? I mean, you seize an oligarch's yacht, it's like seizing a pack of cigarettes. It really doesn't hurt that much. I mean, it may be uncomfortable, but it doesn't hurt that much.
That's true. But at the same time, there are big chunks of accounts being frozen, like $7 billion in the Cayman Islands and $7 billion in Jersey that belonged to Roman Abramovich, who was one of the big oligarchs who owned the Chelsea football team. We're seeing a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of stuff happening that's not being announced. So just for example, every oligarch who's on the sanctions list, and probably every oligarch who's not even on the sanctions list, can't open bank accounts, can't close bank accounts, can't transfer money. All of a sudden, the world has become a very inhospitable place for oligarchs and anybody connected to them. And so I think that these sanctions are quite painful for the people who are subject to them. And I can only hope and pray that more people get sanctioned and that the West doesn't lose its nerve and try to capitulate in order to appease Putin.
Okay, now Ukraine and Zelensky have humiliated Putin in a number of major ways, haven't they? They've destroyed his tanks. They've caused large numbers of casualties. And he wasn't able to take Kyiv. He was throttled. He's now having massive resistance in the Donbass. Biden is providing missiles and missile training so that the defense and counterattack of Ukraine can be more effective. With all that, has this brought pressure on Putin internally?
Well, the answer is, at the moment, no, but that could change. So I'll say very clearly that the oligarchs aren't going to overthrow Putin, and nor will the Russian people at this stage of the game. However, if Putin were to lose the war in an indisputable way, I don't think anyone would allow him to remain president. He's supposed to be a strong man. If he's seen to be a weak man, a loser, he'll get taken out in a second. And that has to be our objective, because when you started asking the question about him being humiliated, I was afraid you were going to say, shouldn't we, isn't it dangerous to humiliate him? And the answer is that it's more dangerous to appease him than humiliate him. The best thing to do with effectively a mafia thug like Putin is to just defeat him. In a negotiation with Russians, if on one side they're saying 100 and the other side is saying 50, no, they're not going to settle on 75. It's either going to be 100 or 50, and that's the same thing true here. There's only two outcomes: either Ukraine wins or Russia wins, and we have to do everything possible to help Ukraine win.
So, would you advocate negotiations at this point?
It's hopeless, and the reason that it's hopeless is that Putin doesn't know negotiating. He doesn't know compromise. He might use negotiations tactically to give him a pause to rearm or something like that, but he has no intention whatsoever of negotiating any kind of settlement which would allow any one of us, the Ukrainians or the West, to feel happy with the outcome.
So you believe the United States and NATO's war aim has to be the defeat of Putin and his eviction from the country?
Well, I think that the aim has to be to win and have everyone in Russia see that he's lost. They'll take care of the second part.
Okay, so they take care of the second part. And what do you see as the end game? What's your prediction as to how all this is going to end? And how long is it going to take?
Well, sadly, I don't see an end game. I don't see Russia winning, and I don't see Ukraine winning. I think that we're going to see, progress at various points from either side, but they're all going to, Ukraine doesn't want to give up territory, and Putin doesn't want to show any weakness. And so we're going to be in a situation which I would describe as another 10-year war. And just so it's clear, this war started 8 years ago. This didn't start on February 24th. This started when Putin took Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. They called it Russian-backed separatists, but this is just that was a Russian operation from the very beginning. And so I'd say the best comparable for where this is going to play out in the future is just to look at a war that most of us probably didn't pay any attention to, was the Iran-Iraq war. That lasted a decade, and there was 1 million dead soldiers from that war. And eventually ended when everyone just exhausted themselves. And I'm afraid that that's probably the most likely outcome here. There's not going to be a clear winner or loser.
Well, Tolstoy wrote a novel, as you know, called War and Peace. Do you see a scenario over the next decade where there is going to be both war and peace, and that kind of a frozen war where there'll be intermittent fighting, and then there'll be a period of where there's a lull, and then it will resume?
Well, I kind of hope that there will be a Cold War. And if it's not a Cold War, I hope that there'll be an intermittent war. And what I really hope is there's not a hardcore hot war like what we're witnessing right now. This is unsustainable for everybody involved, and particularly the Ukrainians, who are just suffering so spectacularly in this story. I mean, I just imagine that you're living if you're Ukrainian, you live in a country, you've done nothing wrong, and you're being murdered on a daily basis by Russian bombs and Russian soldiers. Just horrible, heartbreaking.
Now, we hear in the United States that Biden doesn't want a war with the Russian people and doesn't want to escalate the war, and he doesn't want a no-fly zone, which might engage Russian planes. We might be shooting them out of the sky. Because Russia, after all, it's not like 1939. Russia is a nuclear power, and Putin has already threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Is this really a very dangerous situation for the United States and NATO?
Well, it's of course it's hugely dangerous, but we should also understand that if Putin goes around threatening nuclear war, I mean, at what point do we stand up to him? I mean, do we just say, okay, you can have all of Eastern Europe from 1945 borders because you're threatening nuclear war? And actually, hey, why don't you take Germany as well? I mean, it's the thing is that you have a thug. He's got nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons too. Of course, nobody wants a nuclear war, and I don't think Putin wants a nuclear war. And so he's going around threatening everybody with nuclear war. But there's a concept called mutually assured destruction, which is why there hasn't been a nuclear war. And I have to believe that Putin is, even if he's totally willing to sacrifice his own people, I don't think he wants to die himself in a nuclear war, and that's the most likely outcome if he tries to start something with NATO.
Okay, so back to your personal experience. A tool that Putin has used historically is assassination, political assassination. Perhaps you could start with the story of your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, and then speak about some of the other dissidents and about yourself who were either assassinated or threatened with assassination.
So Sergei Magnitsky uncovered a $230 million government corruption scheme. He testified against the officials involved. He was then arrested by the same officials, put in pretrial detention, tortured for 358 days, and then killed at the age of 37 on November 16, 2009. I then started a campaign to get justice for Sergei. various high-profile Russians joined me in the campaign. One of them, his name was Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was the leader of the opposition. He went around the world lobbying governments and parliaments and Congress for a Magnitsky Act. And in February 2015, he was shot down as he was walking across a bridge in front of the Kremlin, killed. He had a protege. His protege was named Vladimir Karamurza. Vladimir had assisted me when he was working for Boris Nemtsov, and he was then also working with me after Boris Nemtsov to get Magnitsky Acts passed in different countries. He went back to Moscow and he was poisoned with what we believe was Novichok. He survived just barely. He was then poisoned a second time. He then survived that poisoning. And he went back to Russia after that, and he was most recently arrested after calling Putin a murderer on CNN. And he's now being charged with this new crime of spreading disinformation about the war. He's facing a 15-year jail sentence. We also have my lawyer, the lawyer who worked for the Magnitsky family. He was thrown off a 5-story apartment building. And then, of course, they're chasing me all around the world, trying to get me back to Russia so they can do the same thing to me as they did to Sergei. And they've issued 8 Interpol arrest warrants for my arrest. I was arrested in Madrid. I was detained in Geneva on these Russian Interpol warrants. There's a full-time operation going on where lots and lots of terrible violence is being pursued.
Well, you've been charged in Russia, and tried in absentia. So obviously, you have no appetite to go back there. But then, wasn't there a moment in time where Donald Trump met with Putin and promised to extradite you if he caught you, even you weren't even a U.S. citizen at that point, and send you to Russia for trial along with the U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration, McFaul?
Yeah, this was at the Helsinki summit, July 2018. It was right after Robert Mueller indicted the 12 Russian military intelligence officers for hacking the U.S. election. A journalist asked Putin, "Are you ready to hand over the 12 GRU officers?" And Putin said, "Yes, provided that President Trump hands over Bill Browder." And then they added 11 other Americans to the list, including Mike McFaul, the U.S. ambassador, Kyle Parker, he was the chief of staff of the U.S. Helsinki Commission that wrote the Magnitsky Act, various other people. And it took, and when they asked Trump what he thought of this, Trump said, "Yeah, I think it's an exceptional, an incredible offer," he said. That used those words, incredible offer. And it took 4 days for him to walk it back, and it was only when the U.S. Senate was about to vote, and the vote turned out 98-0. It was about an hour before their vote was going to go 98-0, not to hand us over, that Trump kind of meekly walked it back. But if I had been sent back to Russia, I'd been killed very quickly.
In your book, you relate the work you did to bring the money laundering to the attention of the United States government. You yourself didn't sue Putin in the United States, but you spurred an asset forfeiture action brought by the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. Could you just briefly describe that and the course of it?
So when we sought justice for Sergei Magnitsky's murder, one of the things we said was, who got the money? We did a major multi-year money laundering investigation and got lucky with a few tips and a few leaks and a few whistleblowers, and were able to track some of the money that went to purchase high-end luxury apartments in New York. I took the case first to the New York DA's office, and they transferred it to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District. Southern District then began a federal forfeiture case, and that's when Natalia Veselnitskaya showed up as the lawyers for the bad guys. And the case eventually was about to go to court, and then the Russians frantically settled it on the courtroom steps for $6 million.
$6 million.
But in the meantime...
Okay, well, sadly, we have to end, but I have a question for you, Bill Browder, and the question is it possible to take on Putin as you did and win?
Well, I think that Putin presents himself as this sort of indestructible giant when he's just a regular guy, puts his pants on one leg at a time, and he's got pretty bad people working for him. And you can see that in the war in Ukraine where their tanks are running out of gas. And I saw that in my own conflict where they messed up and messed up and messed up at every step of the way. They're brutal, they're totally immoral, they're violent, but they make constant mistakes. And so I think that they're absolutely defeatable in a David and Goliath situation like mine, and in a David and Goliath situation like what Ukraine is suffering. I think it's entirely possible, and we shouldn't overestimate Vladimir Putin's strength.
So there's the answer. Putin, pants on, one leg at a time. Bill Browder, this has just been marvelous. Thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Please visit our website at conversationswithjimzirin.com. All the best, take care, and be well. I'm Jim Zirin.